Hello and welcome back to Preventing Prevent Cambridge, a student campaign against the government's repressive, racist and ineffective Prevent Counter-Extremism programme. This is the fourth in our series of interviews with experts and writers on Prevent and the issues that it's a symptom of and has contributed to. I'm delighted to be joined by two guests, Claudia Radiven and Dr. Faure Walker, to discuss the concepts of radicalisation and extremism and the future of Prevent. Claudia Radiven is a teaching fellow at the University of Leeds, and she's currently pursuing a PhD on British counter-terror measures and developing a model of rehabilitation for those convicted of terror offences. She is also the editor and co-author of a collection of case studies entitled Crimes of States and Powerful Elites. Dr. Faure Walker is senior researcher on the SOAS Influencing Corridors of Power project. He used to be a school teacher in East London, and witnessing Prevent in action firsthand inspired him to begin researching counter-extremism. He convenes the monthly Prevent Digest, and his book, The Emergence of Extremism, will be published next month. So thank you both so much for coming on. Really honoured to have you.
Thanks for having
us.
I want to begin by looking very concept of radicalisation. So Prevent bills itself as a strategy designed to fight political violence by tackling the problem at its roots. And according to counter-extremism practitioners, for someone to hold beliefs deemed to be radical is a predictor of political violence. So Rob, how did this idea linking radical beliefs to violence come to shape government policy in the UK? And does it lead us to a correct understanding of why political violence happens?
I suppose starting with your final question, no, it totally obscures the reason for why political violence happens. So what I'm sure Claudia will step in at some point here, but what Prevent essentially does is it personalizes a political problem. So notion, by saying Prevent, I'm talking about notions of radicalisation. So we live in a functioning democracy. So in an ideal democracy, people would be able to air their grievances in response to the failure of government, and the government would respond, or the electorate would respond through the ballot box to that. But if you start suggesting that people have been radicalised, you're suggesting that that is a personal problem to them. So that their response to a political problem is a personal problem. So that then can be addressed by the government intervening through things like Channel, which is the sort of counter-radicalisation aspects of Prevent. So that would, just to go back to the type of government, that is totally at odds to a democratic society. It does, however, make perfect sense to an autocratic society. So if you had a government that isn't democratically elected, that dictates how everyone ought to behave, then something like Prevent would make perfect sense. And not surprisingly, that's why counter-extremism strategies have been taken up so readily by kind of autocratic societies around the world. But at its core, it's an anti-democratic endeavour, which ultimately makes us less safe, because it means that you're not addressing those political grievances. You're looking at the individual rather than the actual problem.
Right. Claudia, Prevent practitioners often argue that their work, far from being about criminalising innocent people, is about stopping people from being criminalised by identifying them and helping to de-radicalise them before they've committed a crime, which saves them from being put in prison. What would you say to that argument? Is Prevent about reducing criminalisation?
I don't think it's about reducing criminalisation. I mean, if we look at sort of the type of program, it's a pre-crime program. It's sort of there in the name, but in order for pre-crime programs to function, you're already essentially criminalising people based on certain, categories, these vulnerability assessments, and I think with sort of questions like this about, is this effective? Is it decriminalising people? There is that temptation to look at numbers alone, at statistics. But what this can do is it moves away from the fact that at the end of the day, behind those numbers are real people who are suffering very real, very negative consequences from these referrals, or even when they're questioned and not referred. You still earmarked that person as Rob identified. You're identifying them as different, and difference becomes dissent, and dissent becomes there becomes a need for managing them, for managing these individuals or groups of people. And it's in terms of decriminalising or preventing criminalisation, it's not really. That person that's been referred has still been put through the trauma of scrutiny by the state, othering, the ramifications in their work or in their education. You still sort of, you've put a marker on them at the end of the day. So whilst, you know, you may not have given them explicitly a criminal record, I've seen examples of students being alienated in the university when they've been referred, even though they've been deemed to not be a risk. They're not a threat in any way, shape or form. They don't know who referred them, so now there's the doubt in their mind. So you've now sort of made that person separate. You've othered them. That's not really. It's not sort of decriminalizing them. It's doing the opposite. You know, you may not have put you know, a criminal record there, but you've made them this outsider, which, you know, there's been quite a great deal of evidence to suggest that this actually contributes to pushing people further to the fringes. You know, that whole self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, there's evidence to suggest that Prevent has been counterproductive in that way. Cage has written on it substantially, so has the Transnational Institute, as well as a number of academics independently. So if anything, Prevent's doing the opposite of that.
So that's interesting that you talk about Prevent's impact on the innocent people who are referred to the programme, because it's been rebranded in more recent years as being a form of safeguarding, which it was never initially described as. So I wonder if you both could talk a bit about what the significance of framing Prevent as safeguarding has been. Maybe Rob, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, I mean, so this is something that really, when it first started happening, this rebranding of safeguarding, it was a clear kind of PR exercise for a company that started in the Home Office, and you could kind of see it happening with sort of Twitter accounts that were quite close to the Home Office, and then the idea spread out, which is how a lot of these ideas occur. You know, fermented by, just to give a bit of background to that, you've got the RICU, the Research Information and Communications Unit at the Home Office, which is it's the propaganda department. They even describe themselves in internal memos as a bit Cold War-y, and that's their job. They rebrand unpalatable policy, specifically around counter-extremism, with these, you know, really cynical exercise. And I think the most cynical, you know, for a long time has been this rebranding of counter-extremism as safeguarding. And to just give you a sort of my personal and professional take on that, it used to be the case in all schools. So I was a school teacher for 13 years, and it used to be the case that in all schools, every inset, so every training day that teachers went through at the beginning of the year, they would be told, you know, this happened across the country, they'd be told, this person, this one of your colleagues is the safeguarding lead. If you have any concern about any child, you talk to that person, and and they then sort of will keep a record and see if there's a pattern of, you know, so because obviously with children there might be one person seeing something that is insignificant, but if you see a pattern builds up, then you social services would intervene. With the advent of Prevent has now been added on top of that. So there's now extra training, and I'd say excessive training on Prevent, on spotting signs of radicalisation, which has confused matters. Added to which, because Prevent is in itself, you know, the fact that we're having this conversation shows that Prevent is in of itself a political thing. It muddies the water. It means that there is some confusion about people about whether they're willing to report people or not. So you've gone from a very simple safeguarding system in schools to now a very complex system, which not everyone buys into. So that on one level has made children less safe. And the same goes for safeguarding within medical institutions. The same process has been impacted by Prevent. But then there are other aspects to this. So I used to teach in the school just next door to Bethnal Green Academy, which is where the three girls, including Shamima Begum, infamously travelled to Syria, and so those girls ended up, it wasn't picked up that they were thinking about traveling to Syria. They went totally under the radar. And sadly, Shamim Begum, I mean, they've had, there have been deaths of children. I mean, it's just the most horrific nightmare that ensued from that. When I got interested in Prevent, because when I was working previously, prior to Prevent being forced into schools by the Trojan Horse affair, I did occasionally have chats, have conversations with kids who, and I'm going to use two examples, which might seem polar, but they demonstrate the same thing. Either with kids who are expressing, racialized hatred, racism towards other people, threatening violence, or Muslim kids, and I'm not equating this, I'm just using them as examples of this, but or Muslim kids, older Muslim kids, talking about traveling to Afghanistan or traveling to Iraq to take part in some kind of violent conflict. In all of those instances, by having the conversation with me, their teacher, I was able to talk to them about their concerns, express that I also didn't support the war on terror or the various invasions around the world that happened in the name of the coalition forces. And they ended up taking part in legitimate protests, writing to their MPs, becoming democratic citizens. That's what we do. We express our grievances democratically. Those conversations, when Prevent was introduced, stopped overnight, and understandably so, because I would have been obliged to report those conversations to the police or escalate or to social services or whoever. So Prevent has prevented those conversations from happening that are absolutely vital to the type of the safeguarding of the type of issues that it proclaims to be safeguarding. So there's no doubt in my mind that Prevent undermines necessary safeguarding, specifically of the things that it claims to be safeguarding.
Thanks a lot for that. Claudia, did you want to jump in there?
I would agree wholeheartedly with what Rob's just said, particularly that last part in terms of a lot of the things that Prevent claims to do. It actually, in quite often not so subtle ways, does the exact contrary to that, and it's becoming a lot more obvious. And I think this is something that was identified in the Transnational Institute's report, the TNI report, Leaving the War on Terror, that we already have a number of laws and measures in place that dealt with all the issues that Prevent claims to be dealing with in terms of, now we have these added special measures, counter-terror powers, when we actually have a very robust criminal justice system. We don't need to use deportation, we don't need to use extradition, restrictions on movement. We don't need to rely on pre-crime assumptions and classifications. We have evidence-led approaches that are very effective. When we look at what Prevent has done, when all the evidence from both academics but also from so-called counter-terror experts suggests that with a healthy civil society that encourages active participation, etc., you can remove a lot of those vulnerabilities, those risk factors, and so on. What Prevent actually does is the opposite of that. It actually has a very negative effect on civil society. It discourages people from participating actively, and we've seen this with particularly movements around issues to do with Palestine, to do with being against the war on Iraq, other such similar issues in society. People that openly declare their support for issues around Palestine, particularly in the context of universities, students are very often at risk of being earmarked as a risk for that. And we saw that especially recently among high school students as well, younger students than that. In terms of referrals, I don't know the precise figures around that recently, but we saw teachers very openly acting with hostility towards students that expressed support for these causes. When you're almost criminalizing that aspect of civil society, and when you do that, you're just encouraging people to self-regulate, to avoid being open about their political views. And again, you're just pushing people further towards the fringes in that regard. You are generating a risk that probably wouldn't have been there previously. And you're making quite often specific communities, specific individuals feel permanently under surveillance. And this is not what happens in healthy democratic society. And as Rob identified, this is why the prevent policy has been quite inspirational in other countries that have a less than perfect, to say the least, track record towards especially the Muslim community.
Thanks a lot. I want to look now at the concept of extremism, which the government defines as being active or vocal opposition to fundamental British values, and those British values include democracy, the rule of law, mutual tolerance, and all the usual things. Now, in recent years, counter-extremism has become not just about countering violent extremism, but also the category of non-violent extremism. And the Commission for Countering Extremism has often spoken about hateful extremism. So what have been the effects of this recent expansion of the domestic war and terrorist focus? What does it mean for Britain?
I mean, it's difficult to answer this question, because in the same way that the fool is the most difficult person to have an argument with. I mean, it's so patently stupid to be categorizing values by a nationality. It's just absurd from any standpoint other than a hyper-nationalist standpoint. I mean, even any religious standpoint. I mean, any religion in the world would challenge that notion. Any philosophical position would challenge that notion, other than a purely nationalist interpretation of the world, which we live we're under the government of deliberate Brexit and an openly racist prime minister. So of course that's the direction that this has gone on. But I don't think there's really much to be said in terms of intellectualizing what's going on here. It's just basically nationalism and racism. That means to personalize it. I think that it justifies a kind of a more street level nationalism and racism as well. And then to personalize it. So we're talking about British values. My wife wasn't born in Britain originally, so my children, they're pretty young, but they're certainly proud of their Asian heritage. And should they not be? Should they be seen as only partly British because of that? And I've in fact had conversations with, particularly around, I think we need to sort of add this in. Claudia talked about sort of different counter-terrorism measures, but one of the most brutal ones that has been used of late has been the citizenship stripping that we saw with Shamima Begum, for example. And so what this nationalism, the idea of British values, has said is that Shamima Begum is less of a British citizen than someone who is white British. And again, to personalise that, so they're saying that my children are less valued as citizens than someone who is purely white British, which is just deeply offensive. I mean, it's wrong. I don't think it's necessary to intellectualise it anyway. It's just plainly wrong to be doing this. And going back to the original point, to be casting values as British is just wrong and fuels racism at every level of society.
Thanks a lot. That's really interesting. Now, Claudia, this reminds me of something you mentioned a few minutes ago, which is you talked about how prevent is states' incursion into civil society. And with this idea of British values and extremism, non-violent extremism being opposition to British values, that seems a further incursion. It's an expansion of state power into sort of the realm of ideas and thoughts. So do you think that this idea is limited to prevent, or can be limited, or do you think this risks spilling out into sort of other areas as well that aren't to do with prevent specifically?
I think there's absolutely that risk. Once you start accepting this idea of British values, which we don't exactly have a very clear definition of, and we don't actually have an answer as to why they are exclusively British or mutually exclusive to other cultural values. We don't have a clear idea of that. We just have, democracy, rule of law, tolerance of other viewpoints and religions, which is ironic coming from the government, but we won't dwell on that. I think that it will absolutely spill out into other areas. This is just setting the precedent. And if you tell people we're doing this because we care about your security, citizens, we care about you, and that's why you must trust us that this needs to be done. But I think the overt cultural imperialism of Prevent has actually never been clearer than in the rhetoric regarding British values. And I mean, if we look just on the effects on the Muslim community, we've seen through the implementation that there have been these efforts to cultivate the ideal Muslim character based on these British values, someone who is moderate, adheres to these mainstream ideals. And it's unclear from the policy what this mainstream homogenous set of values are. But we do see in the strategy itself, in 2011, it elaborated on projects that were focused on promoting this ideal citizen, wider cohesion goals in English training for people, not just in the UK, but abroad. I'm not sure why Prevent is getting involved in anything abroad. That sounds awfully like other rather historical approaches to cultivating ideal citizens. This idea that, you know, this is how we promote cohesion and moving away from radicalisation, but we can see throughout this emphasis on the superiority of Western democratic culture that anything outside this norm becomes suspicious. Anything in contradiction to the universality of the Western moral code becomes a danger and something that we have to treat with suspicion and largely derision as well. You know, exclude these people, make their lives intolerable. And to suggest that there is some universality to these British values and to place them in opposition directly to radical ideology echoes that kind of historic colonial rhetoric and the associated, you know, Eurocentric Orientalist overtones. You know, these people are the enemy because they're different. And I think there's a very real danger that, not that it will spill over into other areas, but that it is already. And I think we've certainly seen that, especially in the unevenness of the Prevent policy. Not everybody is equal under that policy. So I think we're definitely going to see it spill out into other areas, especially as Rob pointed out with this rather horrifying business about citizenship.
That's very interesting, because one of the things that Prevent practitioners like to stress these days is how Prevent is colorblind and how it also targets far right now. So they point to the rising threat of the far right and of white nationalism as being a justification for why we need a counter-extremism program that tries to combat certain political ideologies rather than just leaving it to criminal law that existed before 9/11. So do either of you think Prevent helps at all in the struggle against the far right? Maybe we could start with you, Claudia.
We can see a classical example of why Prevent can't be redeemed here. If we look at historic cases of Prevent referrals, we don't even have to go that far back now because, you know, they're so regular, such as the Fortnight case, or more recently, the young child who said he would give arms to the oppressed when asked what he'd do if he came into money. And these children, like many previous examples, were securitized, penalized, punished by the state, and most importantly, othered.
Just to jump in there, the Fortnight case, I believe, was when the police came to a child's house because they'd been playing Fortnite.
Yeah, and he'd made a comment about the weapons cache that he'd accumulated on an online game that, you know, he played with his father and so on. Now, whether these cases were taken the full way to the channel panel or not, these kids have had to endure the experience of being othered and securitized in this way for innocent statements. Now, when we compare this to incidents such as the very recent trial of Ben John in Leicester, who is an adult of 21 found with 70,000 far right and white supremacist documents, as well as a bomb-making instruction kit, which I think shows a certain degree of intent, to say the least. Now, by comparison, as an adult, he's avoided prison because he's been tasked by the judge with reading Jane Austen. I'm trying not to laugh because it is so ludicrous, you can't imagine this happens. He's been tasked with reading Jane Austen, Shakespeare, Hardy, Dickens, which he will be tested on by the judge in 4 months' time. And we can read into this that all that is required for the young white male to return to civility, having been engrossed in anti-Semitic, homophobic, white supremacist ideology, is to read some Western classics. But this kind of treatment and sentencing only seems to be open to a certain to people with certain characteristics, and it's usually those who are involved in similar acts, ideologies as this young man. And you can't imagine that judge offering Shamima Begum the chance to read Pride and Prejudice, be tested on it, and then to come home. It would not happen. And she was groomed as a child. And this young man is, according to society as we know it, an adult. And Prevent is held up essentially by that same white supremacism it claims that it now combats by policing far-right terror. And we can see it in action. And, you know, we can see this in the unevenness, the imbalanced approaches, the emphasis on British values, and these methods of control and management of specific communities over others. And this is not to say that, you know, well, we want to see white people or far-right practitioners punished the same way as we see Asian and Muslim communities punished. That's not what I'm driving at all. It's to say that what we are seeing now, this imbalance, is disgraceful. And it, you know, this is why we sort of refer to Prevent as thoroughly ineffective and pernicious.
Thanks a lot. Rob, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think you've made exactly the point that I was going to make. I was just say I was just reading before we came online here that there was in the same week last week when the person was the white supremacist was told to go and read Jane Austen in Leicester in Luton. There was a Muslim man who was sentenced for sharing terrorist propaganda, got an 8-year custodial sentence for effectively very similar crime. But I think the thing to just to flag up here is, and I think Claudia was making this point, but I just want to reiterate it, is that we need to be very careful when we start talking about the far right. That when I talk about the unfairness of I mean, it's not just Prevent here; it's the whole establishment and the judiciary and the media and their judgment of Muslims. I wouldn't suggest that that means that far-right actors should receive sterner custodial sentences, because I think what we're saying is that this kind of clamping down on dissent is ineffective on anyone and is going to drive anyone further to the fringes and perhaps more liable to commit some acts of political violence. And it just the further thing to say is that this focus on the far right, there's actually a trajectory here that we can take from when you mentioned about safeguarding. Safeguarding was one of the first PR exercises that Prevent used to try and rebrand itself as safeguarding, to try and get away from critique of counter-extremism. When that started to fail, it was only then, about a year later, that the targeting of the far right started to happen, and it started to happen on Twitter initially before it actually started to happen in reality, with Prevent teams actually targeting the far right, which again shows you that there was a kind of communications exercise to push that. But it's actually quite a clever move by the government that we have, which I've mentioned this before, where we have an openly racist prime minister. You know, he's written racist columns in the national press. I'm not going to dignify some of the stuff he said, but we all know what it is. And added to which we've got countless Conservative MPs who've said some very unpleasant racist things, on the record of having said some very unpleasant racist things. And by having a strategy that targets kind of street level far right thugs, it totally deflects the attention away from them. Arguably, it's the elites who are causing the racist violence and fomenting a racist society, but they get a free pass by getting Prevent to target the Football Lads Alliance or whatever other organisations that actually aren't doing they're clearly not pleasant people, but they're not achieving a huge amount. And I think that's really, really important, because when we look at how Prevent exists, it's fermented. I think there are kind of 3 levels of people who are involved in promoting Prevent. There are the genuine bigots and zealots, people like Michael Gove, who've written books like Celsius 77, in which he's clearly committed to a kind of clash of civilizations between the West and Islam. Other people like Tony McMahon, who used to work for RICU, who was co-authored Sarah Khan's book with her, Sarah Khan, the Commissioner of Counter-Extremism, who is kind of so committed to this clash of civilizations thesis that he writes books on the self-published books on the Knights Templar in his own time. So there are these yeah, is that ridiculous? But there are these people who are totally committed to that, and that's also, you know, let's bring that up to date with the kind of Reaganism and Thatcherism, the hawkishness from think tanks in the US. What's the name? Simcox, who's now the Commissioner of Counter-Extremism, spent a lot of time with far right think tanks in Washington. So these ideas are coming from them as well. So you've got these real zealots who are pushing for this kind of for the clash of civilizations, for a war with Islam. And then I think you've got people who I'd probably include our Prime Minister Boris Johnson on this. I think he's kind of an opportunistic racist. He'll jump on the bandwagon. He's not particularly committed to any ideology, and you know, a lot of other well, in fact, I'd say, you know, current leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, as well. He's someone who would jump on the bandwagon to promote counter-extremism as well. So there's a lot of, you know, successful politicians who will jump on the bandwagon without necessarily buying into the notion of a clash of civilizations. And then you've got at the third level, you've got just your average civil servant, your average teacher, your average NHS worker who has to do prevent training, kind of nods along, yeah, that seems sensible, without really critiquing what's going on here, because it does seem sensible. You know, we should need to target extremism to stop acts of political violence, but it's only through having conversations like we're having today, where you sort of look at how democracy functions, that you realise how that equation is totally the wrong way up. We need to be encouraging people to talk rather than shutting them down. But that is just the final point about how all of this is precipitated, which goes back to your point, Imran, about the incursion into civil society, is that this whole architecture that's being pushed by the zealots doesn't just happen naturally. It takes a huge amount of effort to push it. And I'm just going to give you 3 examples. There are organisations like CREST, which is a supposed research body, but it's funded entirely by intelligence agencies. People that take funding from CREST often have to sign the Official Secrets Act. CREST, almost universally, when people publish in peer-reviewed journals, they don't cite the conflicts of interest in the fact that they've been funded by the intelligence agency. So there's something very secretive going on there. And that's why, going back to Claudia's earlier point, when all the research is negative about prevent, I agree with that, because any of the research that says anything positive about it has been funded by organisations like CREST. So I don't think we should accept that research, particularly if they've not been honest about where the funding's come from. So there's this kind of quasi-academic area to support it. There's Max Hill QC, who was the former independent review of counter-terrorism legislation. He was only in his job for a few months because he gave a speech in which he said he didn't think there needs to be any counter-terrorism legislation. The criminal law did just fine. And you by doing so, you remove the politics from the criminal law, and actually the law becomes much more effective. Even though the people who came before him had been in the job for respectively 6 years and 10 years, he was moved on after less than 1 year when he started criticising the government's approach. And the final point about the incursion into civil society is that this is precipitated by an active incursion into civil society. So there's an initiative in the Home Office called the Building Stronger Britain Together, which is run from the counter-extremism unit and run in partnership with MC Saatchi, which offer funding, communication support, web design to civil society organisations that are committed to countering extremism. Now, bear in mind, we've been sitting in a country with over a decade of austerity, so lots of things like sports clubs, theatre groups, and old people's groups have lost all of their funding. So not surprisingly, there are in excess of 400 community organisations that have gone to the Home Office and said, yes, we'll promote counter-extremism if you fund us. So there are football clubs, theatre groups, and all these absurd things connected to counter-extremism, which have to say that they support counter-extremism to get their funding. And then those testimonies of those organisations are used by organisations like the counter-extremism, like the Commission for Counter-Extremism, to demonstrate a need for counter-extremism, not recognising that all those people have taken the money and said they support counter-extremism to get the money in the first place. So there's a whole kind of industry here to promote it. So it wouldn't just happen on its own. It's taken a lot of effort from the government to maintain what's going on.
So I want to pause here and think about language for a minute. It's often argued that, I think it's fairly well accepted by many people now, that the media tends to use the word terrorism very selectively, and so they're more likely to use it if it's violence perpetrated by a Muslim than by, for example, white nationalists. But there are equally people who argue that we shouldn't push to have sort of white nationalist violence also characterized as terrorism, and that the term terrorism is so problematic because it's so politically loaded in its way of exceptionalizing violence, and it's just not become, it's no longer useful as a term to use. So I just wanted to get both of your perspectives on that, starting with Claudia.
I think that it's very telling that some of the original, going quite a bit further back now, classifications of terrorism were levelled at individuals and groups who were trying to free themselves from colonial imperial rule. That's when sort of we see this mainstream use of these are terrorists and so on. And many of the tactics that we currently associate with the securitized state, the war on terror, many of the counter-terror DRAD approaches, these were formulated based on approaches used by colonial powers to squash these uprisings, to prevent the process of decolonisation. And this isn't meant to detract from the fact that terrible acts have been carried out by certain groups and individuals. You know, we saw in Manchester in 2017, London as well. And this isn't to suggest that, you know, these people were inspired by anti-imperial action, but more to highlight the way that specific words have come to have particular meanings, and naming someone an extremist, a terrorist, a radical, it now has a particular power, as you've just identified. So in that whatever that person's aims or ideologies, naming them thusly, you delegitimize whatever it is that, you know, they've said that they're about. You've made them the ultimate criminal. And the reason this becomes problematic is when you look at policy document statements, and particularly the extension of the prevent powers for non-violent extremism. The way that the policy says support for extremism is significantly associated with a perception of discrimination and the experience of racial or religious harassment, and also shown that people who distrust Parliament are more likely to be identified as extremist. A negative view of policing. And all that, there's more. I could go on all day. I've scoured that policy document, and you know, when we look at statements like this, it's like, okay, so if that is the marker of what makes someone a potential extremist, unfortunately, there's going to be a large proportion of us who fall into those categories. So in terms of, you know, just throwing the word extremist, throwing the word radical around, you know, it's you basically, according to this policy, anyone who sees a conflict between being British and their own cultural identity is likely to be more supportive of violent extremism. You're now lumping into a mix a huge proportion of people who have suffered prejudice, who have suffered prejudicial action from the police, who do not feel like Parliament represents them. And, you know, if you're going to lump all these people in as extremist or radical, one, as we were saying earlier, with regards to participation in civil society, you're not exactly encouraging people to participate. If anything, you're just alienating them further. And again, when we identify that the prevent policy isn't an evenly applied approach in the first place, it's what's the word? It's outing itself. Prevent is literally outing itself. As you know, we're not going to hide it. This is intentionally directed at specific groups. The media is just piggybacking off that. You know, papers like The Sun and the Daily Mail and so on, you can't really blame them. They're literally taking what the policy is putting out there and they're just publishing it, albeit in really horrifying ways. But it's, I think the media is literally taking the government and policy line and running with it. If anything, it's the government and the policy itself that identifies that no, really, we only categorize certain people in this way, and here's why. You know, I don't think it's the media that started this. They're just taking advantage of that.
Yeah, fascinating. Rob, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point that Claudia makes actually about the media taking a lead from the government. I think that's certainly the case, and I think not just the media, but other governments around the world. So if you look on the .gov website, you can look up the Foreign Office training the Indian government in counter-extremism, which then, and we saw what happened in Kashmir and how Indian Muslims have been appallingly treated. Effectively lynchings happening openly in the streets, and that's unquestionably been precipitated by the British government pushing counter-extremism in India. Similarly, there have been Foreign Office initiatives to promote counter-extremism in China, and we don't need to go into the atrocities that are going on there. So again, it's been this kind of global oppression of Muslims is being actively pushed by the British government. So it's pushed into the media, but also pushed abroad. So I specifically look at the word extremism. In fact, my book is kind of is a book just about that one word. And exactly as Claudia was saying, for terrorism, the same happens. If you look through Parliament, extremism is only used through the first half of the 20th century to look at to describe and discredit independence movements around the fringes of the diminishing British Empire. So that anyone who calls for self-government in different parts of Africa is designated an extremist. Anyone who calls for self-government in Palestine, anyone who calls for self-government in India is designated an extremist, and therefore their cause can be ignored. But if we bring that up to the present day, or certainly to recently, looking specifically at the 7/7 bombings, so the bombings in London in 2005, that was, so Tony Blair was the Prime Minister at the time. They were the first bombing campaign, or the first act of political violence, which politicians immediately described as extremism. And that's important because after 9/11, you'll find very little commentary that refers to extremism in the weeks, months, and years following 9/11. It's not just extremism isn't on our radar as an explanation, because it's perceived as part of the Twin Towers were perceived within their political context. And it took us a while, or took our political leaders a while, to work out how they could delegitimize that political context. But the 7/7 bombings, that was kind of the idea of extremism was ready in prime. So Tony Blair, within an hour and a half of the first bomb going off, was giving a press conference up in Gleneagles where he was talking about the extremism of the bombers. And what gets interesting though is then Tony Blair then loses the next election, and David Cameron takes up the mantle of counter-extremism, and he gives an infamous speech at the Munich Security Conference, in which he says that the 7/7 bombers had nothing to do with British foreign policy and everything to do with their extremist ideology. So he's able to totally delegitimize their views. Now, I'm not saying what they did was legitimate, but their views are real. And he's able to do that, not just in the face of kind of any semblance that might have been the case. He's able to do that in the face of martyr videos that were published on the BBC in primetime news, in which all the bombers said, "We are doing this because of British foreign policy and because of the invasion of Iraq." So by labelling extremism, he gets a free pass to ignore that, added to which he's also being advised by his national security advisors. So specifically Baroness Manningham-Buller, the ex-head of MI6, was telling the Iraq inquiry soon after that the London bombings, she said the radicalisation, which again is a word that we're critiquing, but the radicalisation of British Muslims has happened because of British foreign policy. So, we're recently just pulling out of, another decade later, we're pulling out of Afghanistan, because that basically, by using extremism, the politicians gave themselves a free pass not to consider the impacts of British foreign policy for another decade, just by the use of that word to label and delegitimize something that people were even saying straight up on the national news.
So thinking now about the future of Prevent, we have the government's review of the programme taking place. Of course, this has been a rather troubled affair, to put it mildly. The man initially appointed to lead the review was Lord Carlisle in 2019, and he publicly said that the review was only happening because the government at the time didn't have a majority in the House of Commons, and this supposedly independent lead reviewer admitted that he may have been biased towards Prevent because he had a hand in setting it up. Quite extraordinary. Of course, Rights Watch mounted a very admirable legal challenge and Lord Carlisle stepped down. But the man who's now been appointed as lead reviewer is William Shawcross, and he's previously made the false and Islamophobic claim that more Muslims in a country leads to more terrorism. And he's written a book in defense of the use of torture, including waterboarding in Guantanamo Bay. And this is the person that the government wants to lead the review and to Prevent. So it's no wonder that hundreds of Muslim organizations and human rights groups have boycotted the review. Now, my question to both of you is, what is likely to happen here? Do you think the review is probably going to result in a reinforcement or rebranding of Prevent, or do you think that Prevent might actually just be significantly expanded further because of this?
I would prepare from Shawcross's review. I mean, I've spoken to some people who are quite close to Shawcross. And I think that we can expect the lining up of many so-called experts that, like Shawcross, are very much there to reaffirm and validate the policy for government, people with a track record of supporting this ideology, this policy, activities under Prevent. Some of them have already been named. And I would prepare for the positioning of these experts to be lined up to confirm that Prevent is in fact a brilliant policy that does good work despite the significant evidence to the contrary. In terms of how we can prepare for that, I think it becomes a case of continuing to expose the damage to people's lives that Prevent has done, demonstrating that these cases are not just anecdotes from random people. They're not just, this sort of very passive evidence. These are the real consequences to the actions carried out by Prevent, the self-regulation, the othering, the overt targeting, and difference in treatment of specific groups, and the tremendously negative impacts on people's lives. I think it's important that when we criticize Prevent, particularly when we make comparisons of, look how far-right white people are treated more leniently, etc., emphasizing again that we're not saying that we want everybody to be treated in the same abysmal way that Muslims, people of colour are treated by Prevent. We're not looking for the wholesale securitization of everyone. We have laws in place to deal with what we now call issues pertaining to terrorism. The pre-crime approach is wrong. It isn't evidence-led. It's based on so-called intelligence. But time and time again, we see how these processes, which are based on these very limited positivist assumptions and hark back to this kind of historic race thinking or race science, how they're terribly flawed. And it means that Prevent becomes counterproductive. Unfortunately, the government has made it increasingly difficult to resist Prevent in any way now that it's legally incumbent duty. I think that by continuing to expose the flaws through, our work as academics at all levels, but also making that work accessible to people outside of academia, I think is incredibly important. The press and the government are able to churn out their dialogue on Prevent on a daily basis with a great deal of speed. Obviously, academia is often a much slower process. We have to be rigorous. We have to have all the facts. We have to be able to back those facts up. But I think one way that we can resist the ever-increasing securitization is by raising that awareness, much like, we're doing today. Thank you again for facilitating it. And, raising the awareness, showing people those figures, the policy statements, the overt differences in the way specific communities are treated, essentially just displaying the facts. But I do think Shawcross's review will do nothing but reaffirm and validate whatever the government particularly wants. And we've seen that a lot in the last year, particularly in the wake of the BLM protests last year. There are always experts. I think a number of people refer to it in this way as sort of a specific type of intellectuals that can be rolled out to reaffirm the views that the government wants them to, basically, because it puts them in a better position. And I have no doubt that you know, those people will be sufficiently rewarded for their loyalty to the government line in this regard.
Thank you so much. That's very valuable advice. Do you think that, I mean, because it makes me think that for example, on a university campus, if a majority of people in a university come to think that Prevent is actually terrible and it's not going to help and it's racist and repressive, so I'm just not going to comply with it. Even informally, I'm just not going to comply. That is Prevent being sabotaged. Prevent really can't work. I wonder whether the government is considering this at all. Rob, do you think the spectacle of hundreds of Muslim organizations boycotting their review into the program has even given the government pause for thought, or not, or do they just not care?
I think they probably don't care, but I think they do. This government works on, it governs through public relations and comm strategies rather than through kind of traditional forms of governance. I mean, I think governments have probably forever done that, but this one particularly, and we particularly saw that around kind of the way that the Brexit vote was managed and the way that elections are managed these days. But I just want to revisit the question of Shawcross, because it is ridiculous. I mean, so the earlier question was why not the government choose him to lead the review? Shawcross is a lapdog of the establishment. Not only has he written books and given talks in support of torture and the war on terror, he's also, at the other end of the spectrum, he's the official biographer for the Queen Mother. So this guy is rolled out in any circumstance to support the establishment. So he'll do what the government wants. That's why he's been appointed. So I think that there's another. You know, he is on the record as deeply Islamophobic. You know, you mentioned before about him talking about. I mean, he's actually promoted the far right great replacement theory, which is where you talk about people who aren't white having higher birth rates, and therefore, you know, we're whatever, white people are under threat, and it's kind of absurd. Not just kind of, it is absurd and offensive. But I do wonder if you know, the government might be thinking about ending Prevent. It would certainly be quite a shrewd move to get Shawcross to suggest that Prevent should be ended. And the reason I think that's a possible outcome, it's an outcome that I think that everyone who's opposed to Prevent should be prepared for. Because we need to be quite cautious about triumphalism in the face of Prevent actually being ended, is because this government they've launched a number of very effective initiatives and legislation on the horizon, which they will manage to sail through Parliament with their massive majority to challenge freedom of speech. They're all in the process of seizing institutions. So let's not forget that Shawcross was the chair of the Charity Commission. And when he was the chair of the Charity Commission, he managed to freeze the bank accounts of a number of Muslim charities. You know, really good civil rights organisations like Cage were not allowed to continue to be charities because of his zealous attacks on them. You know, we've got the Office for Students being taken over by you know, hardline conservatives. The government are still trying to push ex-editor of the Daily Mail, what's his name, Dacre, into the chair of Ofcom, which is a kind of terrifying prospect. So actually, I think the government could quite comfortably get rid of Prevent and still achieve much of what they are doing in terms of their kind of culture war and the silencing of dissent. And if they did that, then it would take the wind out of the sails of all of those people who have been against Prevent. So I just think, and that's my kind of voice of caution, is just we need to be slightly careful about what success looks like here, because even if Prevent goes, we've got a seriously unpleasant system of government in this country, and it's going to get worse with the stuff that's being pushed through Parliament at the moment. But I think in terms of how we resist it, yes, I think that mass resistance to prevent certainly would be a positive thing. However, I sort of have my questions. I've got two questions about how effective that could be. One is that it's within, certainly for teachers, it's part of their professional standards that they have to follow prevent. So you do have to pay lip service to it, and that's why after 30 years of teaching, I'm no longer teaching, because I couldn't continue speaking out against prevent as a teacher and maintain my professional standards that were required for me to keep my job. So that's one issue with mass opposition to prevent, and I think you could say the same in the NHS, where it's a duty to follow prevent. It's less so in universities; it's slightly more grey area. But it would be very difficult to have mass dissent within all institutions across the country. So I think how do we resist it? I think we need to keep talking about it as we're doing here today. I think that's the most important thing to do. But there is also, and this is a little plug for something I'm involved in a little bit as an advisor, is the People's Review of Prevent, which is ongoing at the moment. And so that's quite an important initiative. It's being chaired by Professor John Holmwood and Layla, who's based at Prevent Watch, and that will be that's going to be a really important opportunity for whatever the outcome of Shawcross's review, just to have a go-to alternative narrative that people in the media are able to pick up on, because it's perfectly reasonable that a journalist, as Claudia said, journalists follow the government line. And journalists will see the review, they'll see the executive summary, and they will report on it. So it's very important to have the sort of counter-narrative going, because, as we pointed out, there are lots of power structures that are certainly not evidence-based that are supporting prevent. So through the People's Review, there will be something more evidence-based, and certainly John is one of the most rigorous academics that you could ever come across. So that's a really positive thing, and I wonder if I don't know if you could. I know that there's the evidence drive for the People's Review going on at the moment. So I don't know if you could put the link in the along with this video, so that you can see where to share their evidence if they do want to engage in it. But yeah, I think just needing to keep talking about it is absolutely vital at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I will put the link there. We actually had Professor John Holmwood. He was our second interviewee in the series, and he actually spoke about the People's Review, and he said that, well, people might think that this is partisan, but actually the government's review is partisan, and what we're doing is we're going to base this on evidence, and we're going to actually look at the evidence with regards to prevent. But I think that's a really great point on which to end the idea that you spoke about, Rob, of the possible end of prevent, and how we must be wary if the government does decide to go down that road. And that's why our campaign, Preventing Prevent Cambridge, what we really want to do is not see prevent in isolation as a single policy, but we want to talk about all the issues that it brings with it. So the issues that it's obviously a symptom of, but also that it has contributed to as well, such as securitization, surveillance, and Islamophobia. So thank you both so much for coming on. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I mean, personally, I've learned a lot, gained a lot from your insight, and I'm very grateful to you both for giving us the time.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.